Baca Valley, 18 kilometers east of Zali, along a broken ridgeline that looks down onto a narrow border road and a dry riverbed. 0455 hours, 96 U.S. Army Rangers were moving in 2 staggered columns through waist-high scrub and black rock, closing on a storage complex cut into the hillside like a scar. 310 Iranian forces and Hezbollah-aligned guards held the site in 3 rings, backed by 14 heavy machine gun positions and 6 dug-in RPG teams. The objective was simple in language and brutal in execution. Locate and destroy a $50 million weapons cache before it could be dispersed into the region. If it survived the night, the supply route would stay alive for months. For 11 weeks, Signals Intelligence had been tracking the route's pulse, short, encrypted bursts that always appeared within the same 18-minute window before dawn, and then vanished into the noise floor. Imagery analysts watched trucks without plates roll in under tarps, counted sentries by shadow length, mapped the compound's heat signatures as generators cycled and underground ventilation spiked. The pattern never broke. The reason was obvious once the picture came together. The complex wasn't just a warehouse. It was a distribution node with secure storage, hardwired comms, and an underground cutout where crates could be broken down, relabeled, and pushed to multiple destinations in under an hour. The Iranian forces on site weren't conscripts. They were security professionals, disciplined, experienced, and confident enough to stand their ground, because the terrain did half the work for them. The hillside complex sat in defilade behind a natural berm, with only 2 vehicle approaches and a footpath that climbed steeply through loose shale. They had layered obstacles, concertina wire in overlapping arcs, steel doors behind reinforced concrete, and fighting positions built to interlock fields of fire across the approaches. Their overwatch points owned the valley floor, and their sentries had the advantage of elevation, thin air, and familiar ground. They believed the site was untouchable, because anything coming from the obvious directions would be seen early and bled out on the rocks. That belief was the first weakness. U.S. Army planners treated the complex like a living system, not a static target. Analysts built a vulnerability timeline around guard rotations, generator cycles, and the brief moments when external security thinned to move vehicles in and out. And the Americans didn't need the enemy to be careless. They only needed the enemy to be predictable. The approach plan was unconventional by necessity, an axis the defenders considered too slow, too exposed, and too punishing to support an assault force at scale. 4 assault elements were designated and rehearsed repeatedly on a full-scale mock-up of the compound's outer walls and entry points, drilled until every movement was muscle memory and every contingency was preloaded into the plan. Alpha element would anchor the northern approach, fixing the outer sentries and cutting off the ridgeline. Bravo element would push from the east, exploiting a dead ground fold in the terrain to reach the second ring unseen. Charlie element would maintain overwatch and suppress any heavy weapons that came alive on the high points. In Delta element would be the exploitation team, moving straight to the cache locations, placing charges, confirming destruction, and collecting any usable intelligence before the reinforcement window closed. The hard constraint was time. Enemy reinforcements from 2 nearby staging areas could arrive in 38 minutes if the alarm went out clean, faster if the defenders managed to get a message through before the first shots. The entire operation lived and died inside a 55-minute window from first contact to withdrawal. At exactly 0500, the assault began with silence and speed. In the dark, under starlight and muted night vision glow, Alpha element surged to the first wire obstacle and cut through it in seconds, slipping bodies through the gap like water. Bravo element moved simultaneously, and angled low through the shale fold where the defender's line of sight died. Charlie element's overwatch settled onto the ridgeline positions, sensors and optics scanning for the telltale movement of a crew-served weapon pivoting into place. Delta element held back by meters, poised to flood forward the moment the first ring collapsed. The enemy's first reaction was not panic. It was confusion sharpened into action. Iranian forces on the perimeter heard a faint metallic scrape that didn't match the wind. A sentry shifted, shouldered his rifle, and stepped toward the wire line. The gap was already there. In the final steps before he could understand what he was seeing, a suppressed burst cut the sound in half, and he dropped behind the rocks without raising an alarm. At 0504, the first alarm finally snapped into existence. 2 shots, all unsuppressed, fired high by a guard who saw movement and reacted late. The compound woke like an animal. Floodlights tried to bloom, then died as Charlie element neutralized the generator line with precise fire. Radios chirped, boots hammered on concrete. The defenders weren't running blindly. They were moving to pre-planned positions, trying to form a coherent kill zone on the approaches they expected. But the U.S. Army wasn't on those approaches. Alpha element hit the northern fighting positions first, turning the defenders' elevation advantage into a trap. A PKM position tried to swing toward the valley floor, but the gunner never got the angle. Suppressive fire pinned the crew behind their own sandbags, and the Rangers advanced in short, controlled bounds, closing distance under the cover of their own rhythm. Bravo element, still unseen, was already at the second ring, close enough to hear shouted orders and the clack of magazines being seated. At 0508, while Alpha was drawing the outer defender's attention, Bravo element surged through a service gap and seized a key intersection point between two bunkered corridors. The defenders attempted to lock them out by slamming a steel door and establishing an RPG ambush angle down the corridor. It would have worked against a force trying to push straight through the fatal funnel. Instead, Bravo split, pressed into adjacent cover, and used layered fire to freeze the ambush long enough to bypass the corridor entirely through a maintenance cutout. The problem was a choke point designed to stall an assault. The solution was speed, angles, and refusing to play the defender's game. At 10 minutes into the operation, the compound's inner perimeter erupted with coordinated resistance. Iranian forces and aligned guards began feeding fighters into the central spine, using the narrow passages to force close engagements where their numbers could matter. A DSK heavy machine gun tried to come alive on an elevated platform, its muzzle searching for targets in the dark. Charlie Element's Overwatch caught the movement and collapsed it immediately. The heavy weapon's presence reduced to sparks and silence before it could dominate the valley. The battlefield split into simultaneous fights. Alpha Element was methodically collapsing the northern ring, clearing fighting positions one by one, preventing any defenders from regrouping into a coherent counterattack. Bravo Element was deep inside, leveraging speed to keep the defenders off balance. Delta Element moved in behind, exploiting the lanes Alpha and Bravo were carving open, headed for the objective structures marked by thermal anomalies and confirmed by prior intelligence. At 0516, the defenders attempted their first organized counterpush. A group of Iranian forces, roughly 24 strong, moved in a tight cluster down a reinforced corridor toward Bravo's position, using shouted commands and disciplined spacing. Their intent was clear: mass against a smaller element, overwhelm it, then re-establish the inner line. The corridor geometry favored them. The U.S. Army response was equally clear: deny the corridor, break the formation, force them to fight in fragments. Sustained suppressive fire pinned the lead group, while the flanking team moved through an adjacent room line, reappearing at an angle the defenders hadn't covered. The counter-push fractured. Some fell back, some tried to pivot, and in the moment of indecision, the entire formation collapsed into scattered, isolated engagements. At 20 minutes, the fight shifted from perimeter control to objective access. Delta Element reached the first storage wing, an external structure reinforced with concrete and steel, built to look like a maintenance building from a distance. The door was heavier than expected, the frame anchored into the wall with welded plate. A defender behind it fired blindly through a slit, rounds cracking off concrete and throwing chips into the air. The problem was access. The solution was controlled force applied at the right point. The door gave way under concentrated impact, and Delta flowed through, hugging the interior angles, clearing the space in a rapid sweep that left no room for the defenders to regain initiative. Inside, the air changed. It was cooler, with the metallic tang of stored lubricants and the sour trace of fuel. Crates were stacked in tight rows, labeled in multiple languages, some deliberately mismarked to look like civilian goods. Under night vision, tape seams and strapping glowed faintly. Delta didn't pause to admire the find. They moved with practiced efficiency, verifying contents, identifying priority items, and marking the critical stacks for destruction. At 0526, the defenders tried a different tactic: indirect pressure. From a higher position, a ZU-23-2 emplacement began firing down into the compound, not to hit individual targets, but to saturate the open spaces and force the Americans into cover. The sound was unmistakable: deep, repetitive concussions that turned the night into a strobing chaos of dust and shockwaves. For a moment, the compound's center became an exposed bowl. The problem was sudden heavy fire that could stall movement and give the enemy time. The solution was rapid suppression from multiple angles. Charlie Element shifted, found the gun's silhouette, and coordinated fires with Alpha's outer ring position. The ZU-23-2's fire faltered, then stopped entirely, its crew neutralized before they could reacquire. At 30 minutes after first contact, the defenders were still fighting, but their coordination was visibly degrading. Their radios were clogged with overlapping calls. Their commanders tried to pull fighters back into a final line around the underground access point, the heart of the cache. That location was the prize and the trap. It was the one place the defenders could concentrate numbers and exploit geometry to grind the Americans down. Iranian forces moved toward it with urgency, trying to hold the entrance long enough for a message to reach outside reinforcements. The U.S. Army anticipated that collapse. Alpha Element pressed harder, not just clearing positions, but sealing off avenues that fed defenders inward. Bravo element drove toward the spine junctions, denying the enemy the ability to mass. Delta element shifted to the underground access, where the resistance thickened into a wall of fire and movement. The air vibrated with impacts. Dust hung in the beams of night vision like smoke. Every meter forward cost effort. At 0534, the most intense resistance erupted at the subterranean threshold. See, the defenders had prepared the approach with overlapping angles and hard cover, forcing anyone advancing to commit into a narrow exposure. The sound of close-range fire in confined space was different, sharper, louder, the pressure wave hitting like a physical blow. For the enemy, it was the last viable stand. For the U.S. Army, it was the final barrier between mission success and a reinforced fight they could not afford. The problem was a fortified entrance designed to stop an assault cold. The solution was layered pressure and refusal to stall. Suppressive fire fixed defenders behind cover. A flanking push attacked from a side access point that had been mapped weeks earlier by imagery and confirmed by a faint thermal signature of airflow. The defenders tried to shift to meet it, but shifting meant exposing themselves to the original line. In that forced choice, their defense cracked. The threshold opened, not all at once, but in a series of small collapses that added up to a breach. At 0540, Delta element entered the underground section. The environment turned claustrophobic. Concrete walls, narrow corridors, and a low ceiling that trapped sound and magnified every impact. The defenders were still there, fighting in small pockets, using corners and doorways to create sudden, violent ambush points. The U.S. Army moved with disciplined speed, clearing the immediate spaces and pushing the fight forward, never letting it settle into a static exchange that would burn precious minutes. At 45 minutes into the assault, the objective was confirmed. It wasn't one cache, it was a networked stockpile. Guided weapons components, packaged explosives, crates of small arms, and stacked munitions arranged for rapid distribution. This was the $50 million arsenal that had kept the supply route alive. Tools meant to turn regional violence into sustained capability. Delta element began the destruction sequence, placing charges across key stacks in a pattern designed to ensure complete neutralization, not partial damage. The work was fast and methodical, carried out under pressure while the outer elements kept the remaining defenders contained. The enemy perspective shifted from confidence to alarm. Iranian forces who still had cohesion understood what the charges meant. They tried to surge into the underground to stop it, but the corridors were already choked with their own casualties and blocked by the very fortifications they had trusted. Their leaders shouted orders that couldn't translate into action, when the Americans had taken the tempo, and tempo is what wins fights like this. At 0548, the final obstacle appeared. Not a wall, but time. Reports came in through secure comms. Movement on the outer roads, headlights masked, engines throttled low. Reinforcements were coming, and they were close. The U.S. Army didn't need to defeat them. It needed to avoid being fixed in place. The plan shifted smoothly from assault to withdrawal without losing pressure. Alpha and Bravo elements began peeling back along pre-identified routes, maintaining a defensive posture that discouraged pursuit. Charlie element maintained overwatch, ready to collapse any attempt at a last-minute intercept. At 0552, the underground detonations began. The first blast was a deep, contained thump, followed by a rolling concussion that surged up through the hillside like a pulse. Dust and smoke pushed out of vents and cracks. A second detonation followed, larger, the overpressure wave slamming into the valley air and making loose stones jump. The ground seemed to exhale. The sensory impact was total. Orange flashes in the darkness, a roar that swallowed all other sound, and the physical shove of pressure hitting chests and helmets, even at distance. At 0555, the cache was no longer a cache. It was a collapsed space filled with heat, smoke, and twisted debris, the weapons neutralized in seconds that had been years in the making. The defenders' last organized resistance broke in that moment, not because of fear, but because the reason for fighting evaporated into fire and falling concrete. Iranian forces who had been holding tight positions began to pull away, trying to preserve what manpower they could. Their command structure fractured into individual survival decisions. At the 1-hour mark, the U.S. Army was already moving out. The withdrawal was controlled, not hurried, fast enough to stay ahead of reinforcements, disciplined enough to avoid turning into a chase. The Rangers moved through the same broken terrain they had used to approach, bodies low, spacing maintained, rifles scanning, every sense tuned to the possibility of a final ambush. Behind them, the hillside still smoked, the ventilation shafts coughing black plumes into the pre-dawn. At 0606, enemy reinforcements reached the outer area and found only the aftermath, damaged fighting positions, collapsed structures, and the unmistakable signature of a destroyed stockpile. They attempted pursuit for 9 minutes, probing the ridgelines and the dry riverbed, but the window was gone. In the terrain that had favored the defenders now favored the withdrawing Americans, and every attempt to push into the darkness risked walking into overwatch they couldn't see. By 0615, the operation was complete. 96 U.S. Army Rangers had neutralized a $50 million arsenal and shattered a logistics node that had taken months to build and weeks to track, then exited before the enemy could force a second fight. U.S. Army casualties were 2 killed and 9 wounded, evacuated under control without breaking the withdrawal. Enemy losses were 74 killed, 112 wounded, and 39 captured, with the remainder scattered and disorganized in the hills. The destroyed equipment included 620 rifles and carbines, 190 RPG rounds, 84 heavy machine gun barrels and spares, 26 crates of explosives, and guided components valued at an estimated $50 million when assembled into operational capability. The strategic impact was immediate and measurable. The supply route that Iranian forces had relied on wasn't just interrupted, it was stripped of its stockpile and forced back into improvisation, with new movements and new communications patterns that intelligence could exploit. The complex that had been designed to survive airstrikes by hiding underground had been defeated by ground precision and time discipline. Iranian forces had elevation, fortifications, and numbers. What they didn't have was 96 U.S. Army Rangers willing to climb into the dark, take the tempo, and turn a protected node into rubble before sunrise. The facility that was supposed to feed the route became a testament to what happens when Iranian forces build in the shadows and the U.S. Army decides it needs to be taken. Sometimes the strongest bunker in the hills isn't strong enough when Rangers arrive with a plan measured in minutes.